if I was going to actually create this effect using pure rigid bodies, we would use a slightly different approach. I could start by deleting the point cloud, as I'd be first focusing on the behavior of my rigid bodies. So if these are the 3 rocks that I'm going to use, I don't need an emitter object anymore. Instead, I need the rigid body environment. So to make this happen, I'm going to actually delete this rock group, and I'm going to build as many objects as I need and move them into position where I want them to fall. So the advantage here is that I get precise placement over each of the rocks, which is going to help to create a more believable effect. So if I'm using 30 or 40 rocks, I want to make sure that I account for each of those rocks when I first drop them. So I can treat them as groups at this point. I can use a combination of moving, rotating, and even scaling to create rocks of varying sizes. The whole key here is to have 0 overlaps. So I can even move these rocks a little closer. I'll just use a global manipulation mode so the rocks all stay together. So as long as I don't penetrate the original obstacle that I'll be using, I can completely direct this effect. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing just that. And I'll just keep selecting and duplicating all of these objects. So I can do something like that. I'll take these objects here. One looks pretty good. I'll take these 2 objects and I'll move them over to this little overhang. I can also do some random rotations. And of course, one of the tricks you could use is to use the randomize function inside any one of the input pages. Okay, something like that there. So I've got a good collection of rocks. Perhaps I'll add just a few more. I've got 12. I'll use the global COG manipulation mode. I'm just going to flip these rocks over just to give them a slightly different profile. And I'll have these rocks kind of follow the rocks from below. Alright, a little bit more filler, and I think I'm ready to go here. So I've got no overlap, which is perfect. There are a few rocks in the back here that do look like they are overlapping the grid. So I'll just move those guys out of the way. And I can even just take my grid and just lower it ever so slightly. And perhaps just slide it back a touch as well. Okay, so I've got the rocks all set up the way I need them to fall, and now it's a matter of defining the rigid body environment. So to do this, we want to select all of our rocks, minus the grid, of course. We can verify that we have all of our rocks selected. And if we move on over to the Simulate toolbar, we want to create rigid bodies. And we want to create an active rigid body for each of these objects. So I'm going to create an active rigid body for all objects. And with the physics engine, we need to provide an actual shape and a mass for these objects. So for the mass, I'll lose a mass of about 5. I should be able to even randomize the mass. I could even randomize between, say, 4 and 5. So we get a distribution of masses for all of these rocks. And I'm going to actually make sure that they collide with everything in the scene, and the collision type for these objects, I'll actually just use the bounding sphere or even the actual shape collision type. If this is too slow, I can go and use some of these bounding shapes. When the particles contact the surface, I want to make sure that they don't bounce too much, but they have a little bit of moving friction so that they can actually rotate when they hit the surface. If they're at rest, I do want their friction to be considerably higher, as rocks do take a lot of effort to get moving. So these represent my active rigid bodies. If you look in your Explorer, we can set the Explorer scope to an environment scope in which we are now building our effect. So in our environment, in XSI, we can build multiple environments. We have a list of rigid bodies in our group folder. I'm going to specify the passive rigid body. This is a rigid body that doesn't react to gravity. It actually acts as a surface from which active rigid bodies take their collisions. So I'll specify an active rigid body. Again, I want to make sure that the collision type on this one is very accurate, so I can use actual shape. And for this one, again, I want to make sure that I'm not returning too much energy to the objects that collide with it, and that it also has a strong static friction and a fairly low dynamic friction. So the mass here isn't really going to matter too much. Next, we want to add some forces to our environment, so I'll use a typical gravity force to bring gravity into the equation. And that should set up our environment to the point where we're able to play the simulation. If I hit play, we need to build the collision data for each of our objects, and of course we get some incorrect collisions right off the bat. So this is something that we're going to need to fix.